you all hear me okay? Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Father Antonio for the invitation. It's kind of an offer you can't refuse. And looking at my paper, I wish I could refuse it, sort of, and I trust that after you hear it, you'll feel the same way. My paper is titled, at least right now, Absolute Pluralism, How the Dictatorship of Relativism Dictates. Our question, can a liberal society be pluralistic? Well, yes and no, but mostly no. On the one hand, we must acknowledge that liberal society tolerates, indeed generates, a dizzying plurality of private opinions and eccentric lifestyle choices. And we must further acknowledge that our liberal society, which is arguably essentially liberal in a way that European societies are not, seems to celebrate and generate possibilities that other, still more traditional societies do not. If you do not like the education system, for instance, you can try to change it, or you can simply opt out and start your own, at least right now. And such possibilities seem to baffle Europeans. And yet, on the other hand, outside the technological realm, or the technical realm, where one is free to impose the most life-changing technological necessities upon an unsuspecting public who did not ask for them, these opinions and lifestyles can only ever flourish as private options, such that they can never attain the status of a universal and never effectively challenge liberalism's non-negotiable first principles. And of course, these technological impositions don't challenge them either, but express them. So we might say that liberalism tolerates and indeed produces a vast, though ultimately trivial plurality of ineffectual options and lifestyle choices as a matter of necessity, but that this superficial plurality illustrates liberalism's ingenious capacity for recreating everything within its horizon in its own image. This isn't a novel or idiosyncratic criticism. Ronald Beiner has noted that beneath the superficial plurality of liberal culture there lurks a mind-numbing uniformity. Many others have echoed Beiner's observation in the last 20 years or so. John Milbank maintains that liberalism, quote, allows apparent total diversity of choice. At the same time, it is really a formal conspiracy to ensure that no choice can ever be significantly effective. Already, Tocqueville noted that in the United States, nothing really happens. Its apparent dynamism conceals an extraordinary stasis. More menacingly still, end quote, there seems to be a dawning awareness not simply that liberalism manufactures plural uniformity, but that in doing so, liberal democracies have a subtle and sophisticated tendency toward their totalitarian opposites. The intolerance of liberal tolerance is rapidly and deservedly acquiring the status of a cliché. This description is debatable, perhaps, but I'm going to assume that it is essentially correct in order to pursue what I think is a more important and interesting question. Why does liberal society, and by that I mean especially American society, tend ever so subtly toward absolutism? Is that absolutist or totalitarian tendency an accidental historical perversion of American liberalism, or proper to its essence? In addressing these questions, I hope to show why liberal pluralism and liberal absolutism are proportionally and not inversely related, and to shed some light on the character of each. I will conclude with some brief reflections on the implications of this for religious freedom in this year of faith. And needless to say, all of this really needs to be worked out much further. These questions are historically and philosophically complicated. For a generation, historians and political theorists have been divided between an orthodox, Lockean, liberal interpretation of the American founding and a classical Republican interpretation. Consequently, there is a strain of conservative political thought which insists that America, in its origins, if not in essence, is not simply liberal, or rather that classical liberalism, in contrast to, say, Rawlsian proceduralism, is indeed as classical as it is liberal. According to this view, there is deep continuity of thought between classical republicanism and modern republicanism, and even between the theory of natural right in the 18th century and the tradition of jus naturale in the Middle Ages, which is the historical precondition for the liberal idea of government as a trust constituted by civil society. Proponents of this view argue that the American Declaration of Independence, is not simply the practical incarnation of Lockean political philosophy, but that its ideals are an amalgam of 18th century and classical sources, and that the intention of the founders was not to create the commercial republic of Montesquieu or Constant, or the liberal free-for-all of Madisonian factions, each pursuing a private good and regulated by an all-powerful state, but a republic, a sort of Rome on the Potomac, as it were, grounded in classical virtue and in Protestant Christian morality. They cite the founders' fondness for Livy and Tacitus and Cicero and later Gibbon, and maintain that certain features and behaviors in the decades surrounding the Revolution otherwise become unintelligible. The sudden proliferation of Greek and Roman temples on American soil, the Cincinnatus ideal that inspired Washington and others to lay aside their commissions and return to their farms, which inaugurated our tradition of a peaceful transfer of power, the connection between suffrage and property, the founders' distrust of commercial interest, and the spectacle of merchants and lawyers divesting themselves of their business interests, driving themselves into bankruptcy, pretending to be landed gentry in order to qualify for political office. The liberty presupposed and defended by the Declaration, those scholars maintain, is not license, and indeed Locke himself says this much, nor is happiness simply arbitrary self-gratification. Rather, the Republican self-government of the founders presupposes the self-governed man who is master of his passions. Their experiment in ordered liberty requires disinterested virtue for its realization. Often corresponding to this interpretation is a narrative of subsequent fall and decline. Conservative scholars such as Matthew Spalding and Paul Ray complain that the progressives of the late 19th and early 20th century abandoned the natural rights tradition of the founders, trading the negative rights bestowed upon us by nature and nature's God prior to the state for positive rights given to us by the state, and exchanging, in Woodrow Wilson's famous image, the Newtonian Constitution contrived for us by the founders for an organic Darwinian Constitution, adaptable to an evolving human nature and to the exigencies of the moment. The implication is that if we could restrain the liberal state within its, that if we could recover the tradition of natural rights and its attendant federalism, we could restrain the liberal state within its proper original bounds and prevent its trespassing upon the liberty of the church. This, in turn, would help stem the tide of a morally degenerate culture, and an ordered liberty might once again prevail. I'm skeptical of all this, but I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt as an interpretation of the founders' intention, and even so far as it goes as the basic plot structure of the history of American political thought. Of course, liberal thought does not commence in a historical vacuum, but in the ruins of medieval ecclesial and political order. Admittedly, I'm convinced that classical liberalism is more the political manifestation of the massive transvaluation of theology, metaphysics, and natural philosophy underway in the 17th and 18th century than a simple renaissance of classical republicanism, though these two are not mutually exclusive alternatives. And so I'm more inclined than Catholic Republicans to see it as constitutively hostile in history as well as in theory to the basic ontological and anthropological assumptions of Catholic Christianity. Even so, any and all such reactions presuppose and preserve something of what they reject. So I can grant the point of Martin Ronheimer and Charles Taylor that, quote, political liberalism has its roots in cultural premises which cannot be understood independently from the history of the Christian Occident, with its Hebraic, biblical, and Greek and Hellenistic and Roman background. Fine. Thus, I concede the presence of Christian and classical elements alongside and even within the Lockean elements of the founders' vision. And I can agree with Henry Jaffa that Jefferson may have intended his declaration to supply, quote, a link between modern men and classical virtue, or that Madison always intended his argument for many factions in Federalist 10 that they should be subordinate to an ethos of public spirit founded on moral conviction. I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge that progressivism dealt a decisive blow to the natural rights tradition and helped to usher in a cascade of incommensurable rights claims, the administrative state, and the exponential expansion of the scope of government power. And I would probably agree that, on balance, life would be easier under a regime of natural rights liberalism rather than progressive liberalism. I confess that I do find the conservative stress on the founders' intentions slightly odd, perhaps a secular echo of the Protestant principle of sola scriptura with its univocal meaning. It's not self-evident to me why founders' intent should be a fundamental principle of American political philosophy or jurisprudence. It all seems a bit Whiggish. Nevertheless, the fact that many of the founders themselves despaired in the period between the Revolution and the Constitutional Convention at the failure of the new nation to realize their Republican ideals, and were distressed at the orgy of license unleashed by their revolution, suggests a dissonance from the very first between what the founders intended and what they accomplished. And it suggests further that the real question may not be, quote, whether we understand the American founding as it understood itself, end quote, as Jaffa and the neoliberal historians would have it, but whether the founders adequately understood the nature of their own deed. If the United States has an official state philosophy and theology, which it obviously does, it is encapsulated in the Declaration of Independence. Of course, the Declaration is notoriously spare in specifying the theological and ontological basis which it claims for its basic rights, and pious intonations of the laws of nature and nature's God do not make it otherwise. Nevertheless, the Declaration's specifications of those rights themselves, its treatment of the end of government, and its justification for dissolving political bonds with England are all recognizably Lockean in form, irrespective of whatever private predilections Jefferson or the other founders may have had about the relation between liberty, virtue, and self-governance, the content of happiness, or the God who grants us these things. At the very least, the Declaration expresses itself in what J.G.A. Pocock calls quasi-Lockean rhetoric, and leaves the rest to the imagination. Inasmuch as this is true, and inasmuch as Locke himself transposed the basic theological and ontological assumptions of Newtonian mechanics into the political sphere, we can suggest that Woodrow Wilson's observation was perhaps truer than he realized, and that the Newtonianism of our Constitution is much deeper than a mere equilibrium of countervailing forces between co-equal branches of government. And this points to at least two initial problems with the conservative interpretation of the American founding. First, it obscures how the Declaration expresses its understanding of liberty in the language of Lockean natural right, and how the logic of Lockean natural right is corrosive of the very classical and Christian structure from which it drew its strength. And I'll return to this crucial point momentarily. Second, even if a Newtonian constitutional order is preferable to a Darwinian one, it's still Newtonian. It still premises the real order on a counterfactual order, the abstract and artificial states of nature, which is as much an ontological as a historical state, underlying various articulations of liberal theory. Its basic unit of reality is still the inertial mass, the Lockean individual in political terms, emptied of inherent form and finality, abstracted from all relations that constitute its actual existence, and diverted from its inertial tendencies by an extrinsic and all-powerful law, indifferent to the actual natures of the things governed by it, which have all but ceased to exist. To the extent the conservative theorists are correct, then, we can be reasonably certain that the nature which appears to public view will be mechanistic, that nature's God will appear to public view more or less as Newton's voluntarist sovereign, or as the detached Unitarian mechanic which Mr. Jefferson prophesied for America's religious future, that the truth which both Locke and Dignitatis Humanae oblige us to discover will have been reduced a priori to the instrumental deliverances of the Baconian science beloved of Jefferson and officially endorsed by our Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and that religion in the public square will be reduced to an increasingly unintelligible and ineffectual morality bearing little relation to mechanistic reality, and incapable of effectively putting the ontological and anthropological first principles of liberalism, which now dwell eternally in light inaccessible, into question. Which is simply to say that all of that which has come to pass is somehow fated in liberalism's origins. Leon Cass, hardly an enemy of classical liberalism, makes an observation whose importance I do not think even he fully grasps. Quote, "The United States Constitution, which is silent on education and morality, speaks up about scientific progress," end quote, when it grants Congress the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts. "The American Republic," he continues, "is, to my knowledge, the first regime explicitly to embrace scientific and technical progress, and officially to claim its importance for the public good. I would submit that this, as much as anything, supplies a clue to the missing meaning of the laws of nature and nature's God. American constitutional democracy codifies for all eternity the metaphysical and anthropological assumptions of 18th century political thought, which is premised upon the 17th century conflation of nature and art. It is therefore the political incarnation of a concept of nature, freedom, and truth that are essentially, that is, ontologically, technological, and of a corresponding theological extrinsicism whose moralistic tendencies cannot permanently forestall the effects of its planned obsolescence. These are rather sweeping claims, and I realize that in order to vindicate them fully, I would have to undertake a much more comprehensive study of the American founders, their use of the ambient political philosophy of the period, and the relation between this philosophy and the mechanistic conception of nature prevalent in the 18th and 19th century. That's a tall order in and of itself. I'll probably die before it gets done, and it's obviously more than I can do here. Even so, I think we have grounds for suspicion that American republicanism, in its very silence about the ontological and theological first principles of American liberty, violates its own putative neutrality about such principles, and with it, its own ambitions toward a limited state. Notice that this is without taking recourse to those theological and metaphysical arguments which others here have advanced, and with which I agree, that show why a merely juridical neutrality is impossible in principle. It is rather simply to propose that classical liberalism, to say nothing of contemporary liberalism, necessarily fails to be truly liberal, even on its own terms. Nevertheless, this is not yet decisive for my argument. To see more clearly why the freedom secured and promoted by liberalism is contemporaneous with the absolutism of liberal order, and why this order is dangerous and suffocating, we must look more closely at the Lockean conception of natural right presupposed and advanced by the Declaration, particularly in its relation to Locke's understanding of property, which Jefferson accepted with some modifications that arguably radicalized it even further. Hobbes and Locke each ground natural right in natural law, or rather laws of nature, and I should say that because those aren't the same thing. And I should note that I find this to be all but unintelligible given their broader efforts to conceive of nature in mechanistic terms. What can a law of nature finally be when nature itself is reduced to a set of empirically verifiable facts, except something arbitrarily and extrinsically imposed by the divine despot that Professor Bauerschmidt mentioned? Perhaps a more thorough consideration of the common sense philosophy which Jefferson took from Lord Keynes would make more sense of Jefferson's appeal, but I rather doubt it. As with the contriving God who corresponds to mechanistic nature and who's rendered superfluous by knowledge of the mechanism, one suspects that this unintelligibility too is something of a matter of planned obsolescence. But I'm willing to let all that pass for the sake of argument. I should also say that my critique is not the usual moral critique that Locke inaugurates a possessive individualism and an acquisitive science or acquisitive society short on public spirit and indifferent to the common good, though I suppose all that's true enough. Rather, my concern is to show how Lockean natural right and negative liberty, far from being the hedge against the absolute state that conservative liberals imagine it to be, are actually the source of an absoluteness so comprehensive as to be all but invisible. To see this, we must first understand that the right to property is not simply one of the fundamental natural rights in Locke, though of course it is that, but that it is, so to speak, the form of right per se. Why so? In his account of original appropriation, Locke famously maintains that the common store of nature becomes property by being commingled with that labor which properly belongs to each person, it being the extension of his own hands. In adding our labor to the common store, man, quote, hath joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his, end quote. Locke then turns to the example of the food appropriated in the state of nature to demonstrate property's essential characteristic. He writes, quote, the fruit or venison which nourishes the wild Indian, who knows no enclosure and is still a tenant in common, must be his, and so his, i.e., a part of him. that another can no longer have any rights to it. And this is indeed the crucial point, though Rousseau and Hegel will each dispute it in a way. Property, by definition, by Lockean definition, is singular. It excludes the common rights of other men. Property thus negatively demarcates mine and thine, and insofar as property is an extension of my person, me from thee. Property, you might say, is the principle of individuation. And this is why the right to property is not merely one among the rights, but in a sense the form of right. Locke seemingly confirms this when he says that every man hath a property in his own person. In equating person and property, Locke defines the person as an ontologically solitary entity that excludes all other claims of right, and for whom those claims are necessarily an a priori encroachment upon his self-possession. And it should be noted that this account accords perfectly with the account of liberty in an essay concerning human understanding, where he rejects the summum bonum as a vain idea, regards negative freedom, the power to forbear in action, as the source of all liberty, conceives of morality as the relation between an action and a rule, and reduces goodness and happiness to matters of pleasurable sensation. As with Descartes, freedom's first and arguably highest act is its capacity to say no, to negate, to refuse any a priori claims upon my will or person. Locke essentially recreates the person in the image of his voluntarist and unitary God, and this supplies the anthropological foundation for the separation of freedom and truth and the subordination of truth to freedom, thus understood. Of course, Locke does not deny that as the work of God's labor and therefore as God's property, we have a duty to seek the truth and to act morally. Nor does he deny that we should find such determinations of our liberty more satisfying than stupidity or debauchery. There is a moralistic simulacrum of positive freedom in Locke's thought that can make him look traditional at first glance. But the indeterminate self-possession of Lockean freedom, precisely as freedom, is essentially external to truth, and truth is not integral to its realization. So I undertake this obligation, not as the teleological fulfillment of my free rational nature, which alone can unify my desire and heal my divided will and thus fully realize my freedom, but in view of future rewards and punishments extrinsically applied by God. Now, according to Locke and Jefferson, it is the chief end of government to protect and secure the rights which simultaneously belong to us and are threatened by the state of nature. And of course, this is the point at which partisans of modern natural right invoke their origin in the law of nature and nature's God to assert these rights as a pre-political limitation on the state. I don't intend to deny that in the American tradition of jurisprudence, the state, thankfully, has often invoked these rights to restrain its exercise of coercive power. But notice, nevertheless, that to say that it is the chief end of government to protect rights in this negative sense, it is to say that it is the purpose of government to defend my atomic individuality against all a priori claims and obligations upon my person, which can only now be regarded as extrinsic violations of my self-possessed freedom. In effect, government must force me to be free, to paraphrase Rousseau. It must ensure that truth can never outflank freedom or become ultimate. And we saw some very chilling examples, contemporary examples of that yesterday in Bishop Lafitte's presentation. In this connection, it's worth pausing to remember that liberalism first commences with the concern to police the violence between individuals in the hypothetical state of nature, and arguably I would add to confine the church within its proper bounds, not to limit the tyrannical state, which comes with the concern which comes about sort of logically as a consequence of the state having been made absolute. But when the point of government is to serve freedom in this sense, it insinuates the individual's relation to the state into the foundation of all other relations, effectively reconceiving those relations in voluntaristic terms and subordinating them to the regulatory oversight of the state which secures equity in contractual relations. And I would suggest This actually exemplifies a Newtonian conception of the laws of nature. This becomes immediately apparent in Locke's reconception of marriage and family along contractarian lines. In essence, a liberal conception of freedom and the person makes the state the implicit mediator of all human relations, so that our constitutive relation to the state mimics or replaces our constitutive relation to God. This is why liberal freedom and liberal absolutism are proportionally and not inversely related. Locke remarks in the second treatise that law enlarges the scope of freedom. He does not seem to consider that freedom, negatively conceived and originally indifferent to the truth of nature, likewise enlarges the scope of law. But that is precisely the case. With every acknowledgement, discovery, or extension of right comes an extension of the power necessary to secure and enforce that right. And so the state, or its transnational replacement, becomes absolute in the very name of protecting and extending freedom. We're seeing this now in the case of so-called marriage equality and the reconstitution of the family, which of course depends on the biotechnical conquest of nature made possible by the same separation of freedom and truth. No doubt this runs contrary to American cultural traditions and perhaps even to historical legal precedent, but it seems to me to be the perfectly logical outworking of liberal ontological premises. And contrary to natural rights theorists, negative freedom, which is essentially security from extrinsic a priori claims, must be essentially restless. And so it must grow and expand in proportion to those claims. It must fight a continuous rearguard action against the claim even of nature itself, which is why, in a sense, it's always at war with itself. This helps us to see the particular cast of liberal absolutism and to understand the subtle way in which the dictatorship of relativism dictates. The totalitarianism of the liberal state does not consist in its exhaustively determining everything that one can and cannot do. Although it is perhaps worth pointing out that technology has increased the state's capacity to do that to an unprecedented degree. To the contrary, we can see that liberal order persists by ceaselessly atomizing and reatomizing its citizenry, thus generating a kind of atomic plurality and a corresponding space within which voluntary and often momentary attachments can flourish as private options. Indeed, this is grist for the liberal mill. The absolutism rather consists in the fact that wherever these options flourish, wherever you go, so to speak, liberal order is already there, securing the primacy of negative freedom and thus determining the form and manner in which they can flourish. Liberal order and the liberal state perfect what Rousseau saw as the essence of sovereignty, what you might call the metaphysics of the modern state. And I would want to insist that the very notion of the modern state itself carries a metaphysics within it. Rousseau had criticized his liberal predecessors for, quote, having no precise idea of what sovereignty is and for failing to distinguish between mere manifestations of authority and the authority itself. The former, he maintained, are divisible into legislative and executive functions, for instance, and can even exist in a kind of tension with one another or can even be self-limiting in a sense. But the latter is unitary, inalienable, indivisible, and in effect transcendent. It is, in other words, the mortal God which Hobbes sought to construct with his Leviathan. There is no outside the state's sovereignty. And while the state in its sovereignty may restrain its own scope of action, it bears no relation to anything beyond itself over which it is not itself finally arbiter and judge. So too with liberal order as the mediator of human relations, as I have just detailed it. It is the unitary, all-encompassing horizon in which we now live and move and have our being, against whose backdrop social facts are subsequently permitted to appear. a horizon beyond which we can barely see or think and outside of which we cannot act. I mean that metaphorically, but it's also literally, quite frighteningly, literally true when you think about, and we don't often think about, the unprecedented surveillance capacity of the state. I mean, have you ever stopped to think about how much of your day you spend on camera? Hi, Mom. This helps to account for the subtlety of liberal absolutism and liberalism's particular genius at concealing its own theological, ontological, and anthropological judgments behind the veil of neutrality and the renunciation of its own metaphysical and theological competence. Insofar as liberal order has become transcendent, it is essentially invisible. And inasmuch as liberalism succeeds in wiping away the horizon, we no longer experience liberal order as coercive or as absolute, any more than a fish can be said to experience water as wet. And I think this helps to illuminate several features of liberal order as well as the response of many Catholics to it. First, it explains more deeply than a merely moralistic critique of selfish individualism why liberal societies have been corrosive of just those so-called intermediary associations, a term I loathe, which the founders thought necessary for a healthy republic. In brief, because liberal order is essentially a machine for producing in reality the individuals that lie at the theoretical foundations of liberal order. Individuals whose primary relation is to the state, who secures their individuality against the a priori intrusions of those intermediary associations. This will reach its apogee, incidentally, once the biotechnical conquest of procreation transfigures the bonds of kinship and the natural communion that Adrian was so powerfully talking about earlier today. Secondly, this recasts the relationship between the natural rights and progressivist traditions of liberal thought. If this analysis is close to correct, then these are not really the antitheses that so much contemporary conservative scholarship has made them out to be. The surface disagreements between these traditions of thought will turn out to be just that, superficial, more apparent than real. The progressive theory of positive right is the virtual flip side of the negative rights, which secure our atomic individuality. And the rise of the progressive state is virtually fated by our constitutional commitment to the progress of Baconian science, which simultaneously liberates us from biological constraint, conquers time and space, and extends the practical reach of the state's mediation across the continent, across the world, and into the nooks and crannies of life. Liberal order is simply the political form of an essentially technological civilization. And in a closed circle, the progress of technological civilization in realizing its inner logic expands and completes in practical terms the inherent absolutism of liberal order. Third, this helps to illuminate what was, at least until recently, although it seems as if some of us are still trying to hang on to this, the particular symbiosis between American religiosity and the American state, and the moralistic tenor of that relationship. Negatively, American religion always tends toward moralism for the simple reason that this is all religion really can be within the American polity. And this is because, as we have said, is because liberal public order disguises its ontological and anthropological first principles and keeps them at unassailable arm's length. But moralism serves a positive function as well, and here again Rousseau is instructive. Against Hobbes, he recognized that government by the fear of death extends only so far as the sovereign strength extends. Indeed, that there could be no sovereignty unless the state can, quote, transform force into right and obedience into duty, end quote. This is undoubtedly not what John Adams meant when he famously said, "Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And yet Rousseau helps to bring to light an inadvertent, perhaps, instrumentalist sense of Adams' remark, and to explain why American religiosity tends invariably toward a functionalist civil religion whose chief object is the nation itself. Finally, all of this helps explain why, in the absence of a summum bonum, the liberal state effectively becomes the summum bonum as the indispensable precondition for the flourishing of freedom, without which we would naturally revert to the summum malum of sectarian violence and disorder. Time and again, to the point that it's actually gotten quite boring, we see Christian thinkers who attempt to reconcile Christianity and liberal order inadvertently lapse into this very position. One defends the church's freedom by defending as its very condition of possibility the liberal order that is ultimately inimical to it. In the process, one inadvertently exchanges the truth of being and the human person for a moralism, or less, as we saw in Professor Crawford's paper yesterday, that can never reach the real question, which liberalism has already decided in advance. What, if anything, is man? Whatever the merit of fighting the HHS mandate in court, and I certainly agree that we should fight it, there is surely something peculiar about appealing to the state to protect the church against the encroachment of the state. What do we say, please? It is a central teaching of Dignitatis humanae, and a theme that has been subsequently developed by both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, that truth is integral to freedom and vice versa. There's a great deal to say about this that unfortunately I can't say here, but fortunately some of it has already been said in the conference by others already. From the side of the act, we could consider how a free action that is not simultaneously self-generated and responsive to the objectivity of goodness eventually becomes unintelligible as action. From the side of nature, we could discuss how any act contrary to my nature and the objective conditions requisite to my happiness bifurcates body and soul, leaves the will ultimately divided against itself, and is to that extent unfree. As it is, I just mention these things in passing to indicate the richness of this teaching and the general outlines of a critique of liberal freedom which others have already hinted at. Instead, I want to note, in light of this analysis, what I think is an overlooked dimension of the document's claim that, quote, it leaves intact the traditional Catholic teaching on the moral duty of individuals and societies toward the true religion and the one Church of Christ, end quote, and its insistence that the freedom of the Church is the fundamental principle governing relations between the Church and public authority and the whole civil order, end quote. The tendency, of course, is to read these assertions in light of liberal assumptions and to regard them as the Church's plea for a Me Too space within the pluralism and practical atheism of liberal order. But if our assessment of liberal order as a closed totality is correct, then it suggests something more profound, namely that liberal order can only hope to realize its own stated aspiration to true freedom and a limited state if it can somehow acknowledge the full truth of the human person, which it cannot do without simultaneously acknowledging the Church in its own proper nature as a communio personarum that does not just merely logically or temporally precede pre-politically the state, but actually transcends it. Of course, obviously, this would have to be developed to show how the state could acknowledge the reality of the Church without violating the legitimate autonomy of the political order and the freedom of non-believers. Time doesn't permit me to do this, and I think Professor Healy's paper yesterday has already begun to address it. Suffice it to say that I think the outlines of a response are contained in the Church's own insistence upon the difference between the clerical and lay state, as well as between the ecclesial and temporal orders, in its renunciation, of course, of political power, and more deeply still, in its integration of freedom into the very substance of truth. While it is important to reflect on this for the same reason that it is important for Plato to imagine his republic, namely because truth matters and because we must see the truth in order to do the truth, we should harbor no illusions about the effectiveness of such speculations in the practical order. This is not going to happen. The first principles of liberal order are non-negotiable. Indeed, one aspect of liberalism's genius in concealing its first principles from itself, and one index of its absolutism, is that it simply cannot renegotiate its first principles without ceasing to be. And so liberalism cannot acknowledge the church in its universal and sacramental nature, much less acknowledge its authority as an expert in humanity, without acknowledging at the same time that there are more things in heaven and on earth that are dreamt of in liberal theory. That is, without ceasing to be liberal. Which is to say, then, that liberalism cannot acknowledge the reality of the Catholic Church as Catholic, but only as one more sociological fact, one more voluntary congregationalist polity making an appearance within its horizon. The ecclesiology of liberalism is necessarily the ecclesiology one finds in Locke's letter concerning toleration, which has the subordination of the church to the state as its aim. Liberalism is predicated upon a noble but tragically inhuman anthropology, and upon the denial of the church in her true nature, upon the denial of reality, really. So needless to say, I am not optimistic about the future of religious freedom, even in the reduced liberal sense, irrespective of the eventual fate of the HHS mandate. And it is not encouraging to observe the ease with which American Catholics are frequently persuaded in their understandable desire to be effective, to forego both freedom and truth in order to abide by the rules of liberal public reason. Liberal order seems to have won the day. It is absolute, and its absolutism is compounded by a technological order that shares its ontology, and that has as its core the biotechnical liberation of the human being from the constraints of human nature. Its dynamism appears inexorable and its trajectory clear. Liberalism has determined that we are choosers before we are sons or daughters, men or women, or even bodies, so that we now think we can choose whether to be sons or daughters, men or women, and our bodies have been reduced to a mere receptacle for the effective or technological will. So the foreseeable future is liberal and eugenical, and those two things are not accidentally related. The hour is coming, and now is, when the defense of mundane natural realities which classical liberalism simultaneously took for granted and undermined, men, women, marriage, family, will be a countercultural act of defiance, for which a price will most certainly have to be paid. And yet, for all of that, I remain hopeful. No, really. I'm not kidding. Dignitatis humanae asserts that the right to religious freedom is based on the very dignity of the human person as known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself. The reality of religious freedom, then, is included in that truth of man which Christ reveals in showing the face of the Father. If I may take a few liberties of interpretation here, I take that to mean that religious freedom has its source and end both in the inviolable dignity of our rational nature and the inner form of the act of love, which can be solicited but not compelled, and in the transcendent horizon opened up by the resurrection, a horizon in which freedom finds its completion. Christ is the unity of truth and freedom, whose incarnation and resurrection punctures the imminent horizon of death and floods it with the light of eternity. The truth that Christ is liberates us from the timor mortis, as St. Augustine recognized, redefines the bounds of possibility and necessity, and liberates us for an illiberal act of freedom and a joy that exceeds liberalism's eminent horizons. This surely alters and deepens the meaning of religious freedom. Religious freedom is not merely a basic immunity from coercion secured by the indispensable liberal state, though freedom from coercion is obviously a part of it. The religious freedom granted by the transcendent horizon of the resurrection, and which brings the act of love to its terminus, is the freedom to think and to live, and if necessary, to suffer and to die, as witnesses to the truth that we may be otherwise powerless to effect. It is the freedom of the martyr. No state can take away this freedom, though it seems to be the particular genius of liberalism to create its martyrs not visibly by lions in the Colosseum, but invisibly by 10,000 bureaucratic paper cuts. Indeed, this freedom seems to grow in proportion to the attempts to suppress it. For the blood of the martyrs, as Tertullian said, is the seed of the church. Certainly, we must hope that it does not come to that. Certainly, we must hope that the church succeeds in securing even a reduced liberal freedom and in holding the liberal order to its own highest ideals, which are genuine ideals, though they be vitiated at the origins. We must work for this, both because belonging to Christ means belonging to the world that God so loved, because there is indeed a genuine longing for justice in the modern emphasis on rights, and because if liberalism is indeed absolute, we really don't have a choice. We must live in the world as we find it. And in the world that as we find it, there is no desert to retreat to, save the desert of the Spirit. The desert is now Las Vegas or Dubai. And we deal with the ideals and the logic of liberalism in dealing with everything else. Nevertheless, as we work with and within liberalism, we do well in this year of faith to remember this sense of religious freedom, in order to prepare ourselves and our children for the day which is surely coming, when adding a dash of morality to public reason or filing another lawsuit are no longer enough. Thank you.